So welcome to our today's class, economics. We continuing with our revision. Now, yesterday we talked up to equilibrium. Now, for today's class, I will want to tackle on four areas if time allows. We talk about the consumer theory, which is also what we call the theory of consumer behavior. Then we have what we call the theory of production, theory of production, theory of cost, and then what we call the market structures, so that we may finalize on what we call the macroeconomics. Macroeconomics is from demand supply equilibrium, consumer theory, microeconomics, I mean the consumer theory of production and theory of cost and market structures. Then after that, we'll get to the macroeconomics. Now, we begin with the part for now, the consumer theory. Now, this consumer theory, this is the theory that explains why a consumer spends his income the way he does. Sawa sawa, venye anatumia pesa yake. In that case, this is now the theory that explains that. Now, on the consumer theory, there are normally two approaches that we normally use. In this case, we have number one, what we call the cardinal approach, which is the cardinalist, and then we have what we call the ordinal approach. Ordinal approach. That is the approaches that are normally used to explain the consumer behavior. Now, in this case, first, there are some of the things that, because when we talk about the consumer, we talking about him spending his income, and this is generally in consumption. You are spending the income in order to utilize what we call what? There is what we call utility, and then there is what we call the marginal utility. When we talk about utility, this is the satisfaction that is derived from the consumption of a particular good. When we talk of marginal utility, the extra satisfaction from the consumption of an extra unit of a commodity. So now that is what we mean in this case. So generally, when we're talking about the consumer theory, we're talking about the utility, because in this case, for the consumer, for him to spend his income, he wants to maximize on what? Utility. Are we together? So in that case, we are having these two approaches. And number one, we have what we call the cardinal approach. Now, cardinal approach in this case operates under the following assumptions. Number one, it assumes that the consumer is rational. The consumer is said to be rational in the sense that he will spend, or he is aiming at maximizing utility constrained to what? The level of income, to his income. So the aim of the consumer is to maximize utility, but ajui kama pesa pia, his income can also be a what? Constrained in maximizing his utility. That is what we mean when we talk about the consumer being rational. Then the second one, the consumer in this case is that utility is measurable. Utility in this case, the satisfaction from the consumption of a particular good is measurable in what we call what? Either the utilities or what we call the what? Either the utilities or what we call the monetary units. And then the third one, the marginal utility is what? Constant. What we mean in this case, the extra satisfaction of a commodity or an extra unit of a commodity, and then of it will be what? Constant. Are we together? which in this case now is what is bringing us to what we call the law of what? Law of diminishing marginal utility. The law of diminishing marginal utility. And what does the law of diminishing marginal utility state? The law of diminishing marginal utility in this case says that it says that the additional units of a commodity that are consumed by an individual will okay, let me just explain it. As additional units of a commodity are consumed by an individual, the marginal utility will eventually what? The marginal utility of that commodity will eventually decline. What do we mean in this case? Let me say, in this case, we have in this, I can have this as sodas, and I will have the total utility. Are we together? So if in this case, let's say I can consume this, the utility in this case will consume 0, there will be no utility. So maybe it end up 4, 6, 8, 9, ikuje 7, ianze kuteremka. Sawa sawa. This is what we mean. In this case, for you to get the marginal utility, it is change in total utility over the change in what? The change in the quantity. Sawa sawa. So if I take 4 minus 0, remember for the first one, itakuwa 4 minus 0, you divide by that, it will be 4. Sindio? 6 minus 4, it will be 2. Sindio? Hii ingine 8 minus 6, 2. 9 minus 8, 1. 7 minus 9, negative 2. Sindio? Inaenda hivyo. So as you can see in this case, the marginal utility is doing what? Is declining. But in this case, the units that you are consuming bado zinaendelea kufanya nini? Kuongezeka. So as additional units of a commodity are consumed, which in this case hata ukiangalia kwa total utility ina increase. So the total utility will increase up to a point where it will reach its maximum. Are we together? Na ikifika maximum, hapo sasa ndio inaanza kuteremka. What do we mean in this case? The more you are consuming the commodity, in this case it doesn't mean that the more you are getting the satisfaction. Kuna mali itafika sasa ishe, ndio? Are we together? That is what we mean in that case. So this is now what is explaining what we call the law of diminishing what? The law of diminishing marginal utility. However, there are exemptions to this law. The exemptions. What are the exemptions to the law of diminishing marginal utility? The exemptions of the law of diminishing marginal utility, whereby in this case it will now go again as this. Yes? Sorry? Yes. There is what we call the habitual goods, or generally I can add what we call the what? Addictive goods. Addictive goods. Now, when you are addicted to something, the more you consume it, the more you are feeling better. Sindio? Kumaanisha, the more you are consuming those units, the more your marginal utility is increasing. So it is going against the what? That law. Sawa sawa. Then also we have what? Yes. Yes. Marginal utility of what? Marginal utility of money. Ukipewa pesa kidogo, the more you will be in need of money. Sindio? Si kumaanisha ukiongezewa pesa, ni kumaanisha your marginal utility in a decline. See, the more you will be in need of that money. That is what we mean, the marginal utility of money. The other one, we also have what? Abnormal what? Abnormal state of mind. Abnormal state of. Now, kwa wale watu wanakuanga na mental disabilities, Those people will just consume the good. The more they are consuming it, the more they are feeling what? Better, because they are consuming it without even knowing. So in that case, the more they are consuming that good, the more the what? The marginal utility. And therefore, in that case, the marginal utility is not declining. What else? Sorry? Seasonal? The seasonal changes. Seasonal changes. The seasonal changes. Now, when we talk about the seasonal changes here, now in this case, there are some of the commodities that are normally consumed in seasons. Sawa sawa. Kumaanisha during that time, zitakonsumiwa what? More. Sindio? Though in that time, ni kumaanisha the marginal utility of that, ita increase, ita decline. Sinsawa. Because of that season. Because in this case, those commodities will be consumed during that time of season. The other one is consumer what? Yes. We also have what? I can also talk about the what? Your income. See, consumer's income. And how will you want to know the consumer's income in this case? Now, the more your income, the more you are consuming the goods. Sindio? Does it mean that your marginal utility is going to decrease? No, inaendelea to increase. Sindio? Because in this case, you are having money to consume an extra units of all those what? Commodities. Sawa sawa. And that is on the law of diminishing marginal utility. Now, let's talk about on the cardinal approach. The other thing that you need to know is to understand on what we call the consumer equilibrium. The consumer equilibrium under the cardinal approach. And in this case, on the consumer equilibrium, there is the consumer is said to be at equilibrium under this condition, whereby the consumer or the marginal utility of a given good is normally equated to what? The price of that good. Sawa sawa. So if the marginal utility of good X is equal to the price of that good X, then the consumer will be said to be what? At equilibrium. Sawa sawa. The consumer will be said to be at equilibrium at that point. Kwa pamoja. So what you need to know, how do you derive the demand curve of a consumer at equilibrium? Sawa sawa. How will you derive the demand curve for this case? Now, deriving the demand curve, remember in this case, we may have what we call the utility curve, and then we have what we call the marginal utility curve. Sawa sawa. Now, for the utility curve, even though imeanza huku chini. Are we together? So the utility here inapanda, sawa sawa. Then imefika mahali imeanza kuteremka. Kwa pamoja. Are we together? So in this case, the consumer will maximize his utility, because in this case at equilibrium, this is whereby the consumer is maximizing his utility. Are we together? So as at that point, the consumer will maximize his equilibrium, like in our case, if he consumes how many units? 4 units. Sawa sawa. That is when he is maximizing his utility, and it is at that point. Now, what is making now the marginal utility to start declining? It is as a result of what? The marginal utility. Are we together? Now, when the marginal utility in a decline, and then ikifika kwa zero, ianze kuteremka kutoka zero. In that case, hata tungefanya hapa, when the marginal utility is at zero, are we together? That is when now the consumers, the utility inaanza ku decline. Are we together? So in this case, this is the marginal utility ndio ina push the total utility ndio ianze kuteremka. Are we together? Ndio hata ukiangalia hapa, si hapa sasa imeanza kuteremka, iko negative, si ndio? After the maximum, this is the maximum utility which is 9. Tuko pamoja? So ukiangalia hapa ilikuwa 1. Sawa sawa. But now when inaanza kuwa negative, because from here, this is the side that we are talking about it being negative. This is positive. Now the reason that it is negative is because of what I am calling here the marginal utility. Marginal utility hapa imeenda kuwa what? Negative. So imeanza kuwa below 0. Kumaanisha sasa ishapita hapo. Kwa pamoja. So as a result of that, the marginal utility is the one that is pushing the total utility ndio iendelee kufanya nini? Kuteremka. Are we together? And that is what we mean in this case, meaning that the marginal utility here sasa nayo itakaa hivi. This is the marginal utility. Nayo tu ni kuteremka. This is marginal utility. Marginal utility curve. That is a marginal utility curve. And that is what we mean in this regard. That is now when, so for the consumer to be at equilibrium, remember he's maximizing his utility. Sawa. And he will only maximize his utility whereby the marginal utility is equal to the what? The market prices. Are we together? And therefore, for him to maximize utility, the quantity of the goods that he's going to consume the QE, which in this case, if we were to use our example, he will only consume 4 units in order to maximize his what? Utility. Sawa. And that is what we mean in that regard. Now, there is also the criticisms of this theory, what we call the cardinal approach. Criticisms in this case are the same as the limitations. Are we together? And the limitation in this case, we are going to get them out of these assumptions. Are we together? Now, number 1 is that utility cannot be what? Utility cannot be measured reliable. Hawezi niambia sasa saizi, the more you are consuming the given good, you will measure how you are going to be satisfied by that good. Sindio? So in that case, utility cannot be measured. Are we together? Then number 2 is that the marginal utility cannot be what? Constant. The marginal utility in that case is not going to be constant. The extra consumption of an extra unit of a commodity, how will it be constant? And yet you are consuming an extra unit of a commodity. So in that case is also another limitation. Then the other one is on now the law of diminishing marginal utility. Now in this case, the law is based on what we call the introspection. When we talk about introspection, we mean that the law is based on what we call the psychological law. Psychology is not something that has been tested. And then the last one is that the law of diminishing marginal utility is not applicable everywhere. Sawa. And that is what we mean in that case. That is the limitations, or what we call the criticisms of the cardinalist theory. And that is a question in May 2019. It was question number 3A. You will also check on that case. May 2019 question 3A, and that was Roman number 2, limitations of cardinal approach to measuring utility, and is what I've talked about in that regard. Let's get to the second approach, which in this case is now what we call the ordinaries theory. Ordinaries theory in this case is also what we call the indifference what? Indifference curve. Indifference curve approach. The indifference curve approach. Now, in this case also, this one will operate under the following assumption. It operates under the following assumptions. Number 1, that the consumer is what? That the consumer is rational. Now, in this case, remember we say that the consumer is rational since he's aiming at maximizing his utility given his constraint by his income. Sawa sawa. This is on income peke yake. Now, when you talk about consumer being rational in this case, is aiming at maximizing utility given his constraint of income and also the market prices of the commodity. The market prices of that commodity. Are we together? That is now the difference. In this case, it's on the basis of income peke yake. This one is on the basis of the what? The market prices of the same commodity. Then number two, the utility is also said to be ordinal. When you talk of utility being ordinal, we mean that in this case, you can rank what? The satisfaction that you are deriving from different goods. Unaweza rank from yenye una get more satisfaction up to the what? The one that you are getting least satisfaction. That is what we call we say utility is said to be ordinal. Or then the other one is that utility depends on the number of units consumed. Utility depends on the number of units consumed. Utility depends on the number of units consumed. What we mean in this case, the utility will depend on the quantities of what? The goods that you are consuming. So consume more goods, you increase your utility. So that is now what also this one means. And then the other one is what we call the what? Consistency, and what we call the what? Transitivity. Consistency and what we call transitivity. Now, listen, when we're talking about the ordinal approaches or indifference curve, in this case, we normally base on two commodities. Because consumer will be said to be indifferent if he is consuming different types of goods. Sawa sawa. Kama in that case, una consumer a good A or good B. In that case, the consumer will be said to be what? Indifference. Na hapo sasa ndo indifference in a right. Are we together? So as a result of that now, there is what we call the consistency. Kama for example, tuseme, the consumer in this case is consuming combination of good what? Maybe hata hiyo niite combination of good A. Hapa kunaweza kuwa maybe two types of goods in that good A. Sawa sawa. Are we together? Because when I talk about the combination, in this case, you have to consume two goods for you to be at a difference. Are we together? So in that case, the consumer may consume A over what? B. Sawa sawa. Are we together? So the consumer will be said to be consistent in that is going to consume combination of A consistently. Kama ni good XY, which is on the combination of A and B, hiyo ndo watashindia kuconsume. Sawa sawa. It will be consistent in consuming that good. Then we have what we call the transitivity. Now, in this case, we have combination A over B. We may also have the combination B over what? C. So in this case, the transitivity is in here. Kama alikuwa na consume combination of A over B, and then he is also consuming this combination of B over C, then the consumer will be also said to have or to be consuming A over what? C. That is now the transitivity. He will be consuming A over C. And is as a result of it, if he's consuming A over B, ni kumaanisha this one will also be more, A will be more than, since A is more or is consuming A over B, then in this case, and B is over C, then it means that A ndo atakuwa nini? Ataconsume. Sawa sawa. So at the end of it, when we talk about the transitivity, kumaanisha A will be consumed over what? Over C. Sawa sawa. So when we talk about the combination, we are talking about two what? two goods. Sawa sawa. So usiseme hapa hii ni combination of only one good. Sawa sawa. Because when we talk about indifference curves, I've said the consumer will be said to be different if he is consuming what? Two types of goods. Because if you are consuming one good, in that case you are not indifferent. But in this case you are consuming two goods that yield the same what? Utility. Sawa sawa. Which is now giving us rise to what we call in the indifference what? The indifference curve. What is giving rise to what we call the indifference curve? What is giving rise to what we call the indifference curve? Now, when we talk about the indifference curve, in this case, this is now what is helping us to explain on what we call the consumer what? Equilibrium. The consumer equilibrium, and in this case is at what? The ordinarist approach. Sawa sawa. We want to know how the consumer will be at equilibrium. Now, in this case, normally we use two approaches here. There is one for a difference curve, and then there is the other one for what? The other one for what we call the what? Budget line. Sawa sawa. And I want you to get this, because what we are talking about here, this is also what we're going to relate on what we call the theory of production. Kama hamjaijua. There is what we call the isoquants, and we have what we call the isocost line. Sawa sawa. For these ones, we normally use it on the consumer. Sawa sawa. But still, it's just the same explanation. Only that, in this case, we are relating to consumer. For the isocost line or isoquants, in this case, we normally relate to what? The production. Sawa sawa. Which in this case is just the same thing. Ni kitu tu kimoja, only that hii ina deal na consumer, hiyo ingine ina deal na production. Kwa pamoja. Now, when we talk about the indifference curve, now the indifference curve is a locus of 2 points representing two types of what? Goods that yield same utility, so that the consumer will be said to be indifferent. Sawa sawa. Two types of goods that yield same utility, so that the consumer will yield, so that the consumer can be said to be different. The consumer will be said to be indifferent because he consuming two different types of goods. Sawa sawa. That is what we mean in that regard. So in this case, when we talk about the difference curve, hata ukienda kwa isoquant, utaona tulichota kitu inakaa hivyo. Sawa sawa. Which in this case, it is supposed to be convex to the what? Origin. And therefore, in this case, I will have good Y. Remember, in this case, is also consumed good what? Lazima ukuwe una consume two goods. Sawa sawa. So that you may yield same utility. So in this case, this is now what we call in the indifference curve. Sawa sawa. That is now what we call in the indifference curve, U. Then we have, I can have C and we have D here. Kwa pamoja. Sawa sawa. Now, for the consumer to maximize his utility, lazima ikuwe at what? That point, the indifference curve. Sawa sawa. Is consuming two goods that yield the same utility. Kwa pamoja. So the maximum utility is attained at point A and what? That is through or along the what? The indifference curve. Sawa sawa. Now at point D, in this case, it means that the consumer is consuming small quantities of what? These two goods, X and Y. Sawa sawa. And now for him to achieve point C, he must consume large quantities of what? Good X and what? Good Y, do I achieve that point C? Sawa sawa. Are we together? That is what we mean in that regard. So there is also what we call the difference map. Difference map in this case is just a set of what? A difference curve. Sawa sawa. Hiyo sitaelezea. Sawa sawa. I will not talk about that. Then there is now what we call the slope of indifference curve. Sawa sawa. The slope of indifference curve. Now the slope of indifference curve, will get it from here. I will have that. The slope of indifference curve. Slope of indifference curve. Sawa sawa. Now, when we talk about slope of indifference curve, in this case is what is going to bring out what we call the marginal rate of what? Substitution. Sawa sawa. Listen, in this case, as you consume this good, you cannot consume these two goods at the same quantity. Are we together? Lazima moja ukuwa na consume at less quantity, ingine ikikuwa juu. Sawa sawa. Kumaanisha you will be substituting from consumption of this good X to good what? Y. Sawa sawa. Or good Y to good what? X. Sawa sawa. And this is now what is giving rise to what we call the marginal rate of what? The marginal rate of substitution. Sawa sawa. So marginal rate of substitution, this is the absolute slope. The absolute slope of what? The absolute slope of the indifference curve. The absolute value, I mean. The absolute value of the slope of the indifference curve is now what we call the marginal rate of what? Substitution. So kumaanisha, when we talk about the marginal rate of substitution, you are substituting from good X to what? Good Y. You are substituting from that particular good X to good Y. Sawa sawa. So how do you get the marginal rate of substitution? Marginal rate of substitution will be the marginal utility of X, you divide by the marginal utility of what? That is marginal rate of substitution of X to what? To Y. Una consume X, unataka to consume more of what? Y. Sawa sawa. Ama you nimekuambia, in this case you cannot consume them at the same quantity. Sawa sawa. Which in that case, that is what is giving rise to what we call the marginal rate of what? Marginal rates of substitution. Which in this case now will give us, will give rise now to what we call the properties of what? Indifference curves. Sawa sawa. And what are the properties of indifference curve? One of it is what? Negative slope. One of it in this case is a negative slope. When we talk about negative slope, because is as a result of this, if you consume more of this, ikumaanisha hii itakuwa reduced. Sawa sawa. If you consume more of X, Y it will be what? Reduced. Ndio. That is now what we giving rise to what we call the negative slope. Ni kama tu price. As the price of a commodity increase, ina reduce. Sawa sawa. Ikiteremka, in that case inafanya nini? Una consume more. Si ndio? Demand. And that's why demand is always a negative slope. Now the second property in this case is now what we call the what? It does no intersection. Sawa sawa. There is no intersection. Now, in this case, when we talk about intersection will mean that there are two different levels of satisfactions, which in this case, they are not attainable. Ama unaweza kuwa na level ya you are satisfied on this side and this other side of the same goods. No, you cannot have different levels of satisfaction on the same commodity. And that's why in that case, it is a what? There is no, or they do not intersect. Indifference curves do not intersect. Then the other one, they are convex to the origin. Convex to the origin. Now, in this case, the convex to the origin, in this case, is as a result of the following. Now, when you check on this case, there is what we call in the slope of the indifference curve. Are we together? And when you check on the slope of the indifference curve in this case, it is what we said, the absolute value of the what? the absolute value of the slope of indifference curve is what we call in the marginal rate of substitution. Sawa sawa. And as you can see, the marginal rate of substitution in this case will always be diminishing. Sawa sawa. What we mean in this case, the marginal rate of substitution, about you are substituting from a particular commodity to another commodity. Sawa sawa. And as at the end of it, in this case, because the more you are consuming X, less you are consuming this. Ni kumaanisha itapanda ama ita decrease. Haitapanda, because in this case kama unaongeza hii lazima hii ingine reduce. Si ndio? If you increase X, lazima hii ingine reduce. And therefore in that case, the marginal rate of substitution of the two commodities will always be what? Diminishing. Sawa sawa. And that is what we mean in that case, the convex to the origin. Now let's get to the budget line. Budget line. Budget line. Now, when we talk about the budget line, this is just a locus of point representing the showing two combinations of goods that can be bought at a given income given the market prices. Sawa sawa. The locus of point representing two combination of goods that can be bought given at a given income given the market prices of what? That commodity. Now this is what we mean. Generally is out of budgets. You know what's a budget? Are we together? The budget. Now, in this case, when we talk of a budget line, is normally a straight what? A straight line. So in that case, in kumaanisha, you're not going to consume the goods that you are going to consume. You will consume them depending on your income and also the market prices of that what? Of that commodity. Sawa sawa. And how will a consumer in this case determine the level of income that he may derive from the consumption of a particular goods? Remember, in this case, we are talking about two type combination of goods. Sawa sawa. So for you to know the total income to be spent in a particular good, because in this case, we are talking about a budget, will be the price of X, you multiply by a quantity of X, you add price of Y, you multiply by a quantity of what? Hiyo ndio itakupea the budget. The income that you may require in consumption of those two types of what? Those two types of goods. Are we together? That is what we mean in that regard. So in this case, we can also talk about the consumer equilibrium still at the budget line. Now, the consumer equilibrium at the budget line, there must be conditions. There are two conditions in this case that must be fulfilled by the consumer for him to be at equilibrium. Sawa sawa. And one of the condition is that the marginal rate of substitution should always be equal to the ratio of what? The ratio of the commodity what? Prices or the prices of that commodity. The marginal rate of substitution should be equal to the ratio of the commodity prices. This is what we mean. The marginal rate of substitution of X over Y, we say it is equal to marginal utility of X over marginal utility of Y. In this case, should be equal to the what? The prices. That is one of the conditions. And then number two is that the indifference curve should be convex to the what? Convex to the origin. And this is what we mean. The indifference curve should be convex to the origin. Convex to the origin. So in this case, sasa hiyo ndo budget line. The difference curve, remember, in this case is the convex to the what? Convex to the origin. Convex to the origin. Kumaanisha in this case, for the commodity that the consumer will have to consume for him to be at equilibrium, ni hiyo. This is at that point. Because in that case, two conditions must be fulfilled. One is that marginal rate of substitution should be equated to the ratio of the commodity prices. And the second one is that the difference cost must be convex to the origin. And this is now our budget. This is now our budget line. Sawa sawa. That is now what we mean when we talk about the consumer equilibrium, and that is consumer equilibrium, and that is at the budget line. So at your own time, make sure that you also know the effects of the price changes, that is on our consumer equilibrium, and also you know the effects of what we call the income or changes in income on our consumer equilibrium. Sawa sawa. Ujue how are they coming up with what we call the income consumption curve? That is on the changes in what? The effects of changes in income on consumer equilibrium. And then also, you know, the effect of changes in income on the changes in prices on our consumer equilibrium. Where how they are coming up with what we call the price consumption curve. Sawa sawa. You also have to read on the same. Then we have the applications of indifference curves. The applications of indifference curves. The applications of indifference curve. Now, indifference curves may be applied in the following. Number one is when distinguishing the substitution effect and what we call the income effect. The substitution effect and the income. This one we are getting it when we talk about the substitution effect. Hapa tunaongelea mambo ya difference curve, where you are shifting from a particular good to another good. Sawa sawa. That is now the substitution effect. When you talk about the income effect, when you talk of income effect, in this case on the budget line, you will have to consume a good given your income. Sawa sawa. Kumaanisha as your income increases, the more you're going to consume a particular good. So ni kumaanisha unaweza consume X over what? Y. Sawa sawa. So the effect in this case is on relation to what? The substitution. Kumaanisha the price effect of a commodity should be equal to the substitution effect and the income what? Kama ujui. Because in this case, you are going to substitute from consumption of a good as your income increases. Sindio? Unaweza consume more of X, your income in increase. Sindio? May also consume more of Y because your income has increased. Sawa sawa. And that is now what we're talking about, the income effect. Then the second one is to distinguish given goods, the given goods and inferior what? Inferior goods. The given goods and the inferior goods. Now, when we talk of inferior goods, we say that those goods that are consumed at relatively small what? Small amounts. Sawa sawa. Now, when we talk about the given goods, what are given goods? We say these are very inferior goods that normally form part of the household what? Budgets. Sawa sawa. So in this case, for the indifference, the given goods, remember we say they go against the what? Law of what? Demand. Sindio? Zikiongezeka, the price ikiongezeka, you will have to consume them. Sawa sawa. They increase with the increase in what? So at the end of it, they will be having what we call the upward what? Upward sloping. So now, in this case, however, given the real incomes of the consumer, sindio, the real, so in the real incomes of the consumer, like for example, for a given good, If the consumer is having there is real income, ni kumaanisha you'll have to consume the two goods, sindio? But however, is not going to consume them at the same price. I mean, at the same quantity. Because in this case, remember when we're talking about the given goods, zina increase with the increase in what? Income. So at that real income, at a consume less. But when the income increases of that consumer, zita increase. Sawa sawa. Are we together? So in this case, kama for example, the price iko chini. If the price of that given good imeongezewa, ni kumaanisha the consumer will have to do what? Hata kama income yake haiongezeki, he will have to consume that good. Sindio? Because in this case, they are generally, I normally call them necessities. However, if I talk of necessities, it will confuse you. Because when we talk about the given goods, they are very inferior goods. Ni kumaanisha those are goods that hata uwezi kaa kama hauna. Because if we say they are going against the law of demand, ni kumaanisha hata kama wataongezea price kidogo, you will have to consume that good. Sawa sawa? Yeah. Are we together? So in that case, when we talk about the substitution effect in this case, it means that if your income, kama hapa kuna good X na kuna good Y, if you are going to consume more of this, more of good X can either be bought or less of good X can either be what? Bought. This is depending on your level of income. Sawa sawa. Same case with Y. If you are consuming Y, more of good Y can be consumed or less, because in that case in kumaanisha ina depend whether in that case the price imepanda ama inateremka. However, ikipanda, at the end of it you will have to consume. In sawa. Are we together? But this case the consumer will consume them as his income increases. Ikiongezeka ni kumaanisha they have more of them, they will have to be bought. Ikireduce ni kumaanisha in that case you'll just consume less of what? Those two commodities. Then the other one is on the indifference curves can also be used to derive what we call the what? Angel curves. In the derivation of what we call the angel curves. Derivation of what we call the angel curves. Now, when you talk about the angel curve, is also what we call the income demand what? The income demand curve. The income demand curve. This is what we mean. This is what we mean. I will have now the good X here, and then good Y. Good Y. Sawa sawa. These are the budget lines. That is the budget line. And then we have, no, this is, yeah, this is, okay. Can have this good Y. Yeah. Now this is now what we call in the what? Income consumption curve. Sawa sawa. Which in this case is now used to derive the income. This is now we want to derive what we call the income what? The income consumption, the income demand curve, I mean. Now the income demand curve in this case will be developed this way. In that case, I will have that. Then we'll also have this, yeah. Remember, this is this is for good Y. This should be good X. Sorry, good Y. That is good X. In this case, we want to develop what we call the income what? Income demand curve. That is now this will just be the quantity. So in that case, what we mean here, you are developing what we call the income demand curve, and this is now the income demand curve, which in this case is now what we call in the angel, the income demand curve, which in this case is now what we call in the angel curve. Sorry, in that case, which is now derived out of what we call the income consumption note, the income consumption curve. So this is now what we call in the angel curve, the angel curve, or what we call the income demand curve. So it can be used in derivation of the income demand curve, the income demand curve. With the question on May 2017, question 1C, the question in May 2017, question 1C. Now, we continue. The other application is now on the international what? International economics. International economics. International economics. Now, on international economics, in this case, is generally on what we call the welfare effects of tariffs, and generally also what we call the what? The export promotions. Now, if in this case, this is just for the government. If the government in this case, they want to improve or they want to improve the export promotion, they are going to impose what we call the what? Taxes now as the increase in what we call the imported sugar. So if in this case, the government what impose taxes on imports, ni kumaanisha in this case, their main objective is to make the exports more cheaper. Sawa sawa. They want to make, in this case, what they are trying to do, they are putting a restriction on what we call in the what? The import sugar. Sawa sawa. So on welfare effects of the tariffs and export promotion is just on the imposition of those tariffs and what we call in the what? The taxes. In that case, the government in inataka, for example, if they want to increase the locally manufactured good, what increase the taxes on the imports, which in this case, what improve the taxes on imports, ni kumaanisha they are making the imports more expensive. Sindio? Which in this case, watu watanunua, they will have to rely on the what? The locally manufactured goods. And that is now what we call the what? Generally is whereby they are protecting the infant industries. Protecting the infant industries. And then the last one is to examine the different welfare effects of different government what? Policies. To examine the different welfare effects and what we call the different welfare effects of different government policies. This is just in the taxes and subsidies. Now, in this case, when the government imposes taxes on goods, they are making them to be what? More expensive. But now in this case, they can introduce what we call the subsidies. Subsidies in this case will make goods to be more what? Cheaper for consumption. Sawa sawa? Yes, as the taxes in this case will make the goods to be more what? Expensive. Now, the last part on this case you have to understand is what we call the consumer what? Consumer surplus. And what is the consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is the difference between what? The difference between the price that the consumer is willing to pay for a good and the actual price of what? That good. Sawa sawa. That is now what we call kuna ile. There was what you are willing to pay. Are we together? And there is the actual price of that commodity. This is what we mean. What customers are willing to pay is the price at equilibrium. Sawa sawa. Which in this case, this is what I mean. This is now what we mean. What I mean, this is now what the actual price, which is the price of the equilibrium price. Sawa sawa. And this, the consumer in this case is willing to pay what? P1. This is the price that the consumer is willing to pay. And the equilibrium price ni ngapi? PE. Sawa sawa. The difference here, this is now what we call in the difference between the actual price and also what we call the price at which the consumer is willing to pay the good is what we call in the consumer surplus. So, remember, this is on the demand curve. Are we together? So this is now what we call in the consumer what? Consumer surplus. The consumer surplus. Hii sasa ndo tunaita producer what? Yeah, producer surplus. Sawa sawa. Kuna ile price ana win to sell the commodity, but there is the actual price. Sawa sawa. And that is what we mean in that regard. That is on the consumer theory. Now, theory of production. That is on the consumer theory. Let's get to the theory of production. The theory of production. Theory of production. Now, when you talk about production, in this case, is any activity that helps in satisfactions of the human wants. So, any activity that helps in satisfaction of the human wants. We have the stages of production, or what we call the levels of production. Under the stages or levels of production, number one, we have what we call the extractive industry. The extractive industry is what we call the primary level, whereby in this case, this is whereby now you are extracting the raw materials for production. So, then the second one is what we call the manufacturing and construction industry, which is now the secondary level. Now, in this case, this is now where you are using the raw materials in order to produce the what? The commodity. So, and then kuna what we call the tertiary, or what we call the what? The service level. In this case, it is involves all the economic activities that deal with the provision of the services. This is whereby we may have what we call the commercial services, or what we call the what? We may have commercial services, or what we call the personal or direct services. Now, the other thing that you need to know is the factors of production. And the factors of production in this case, I know you are aware, we have land, labor, capital, and also we have what? Enterprises. Sawa. You need to know the benefits that are on the reward for each factor of production. The reward for land in that case will be rent. Sindio? Labor, wages. Capital, interest. Sawa. And then for the enterprises is what? Profits. Sawa. Now, the other thing that you need to know is efficiency. The efficiency, we have also the supply and division of labor and specialization. You need to understand what we mean when we talk about the supply of labor. You need also to understand when we talk about the efficiency of labor, and also when you talk of division of labor and what? Specialization. When you talk about the supply of labor, in this case, is just the number of hours of work which are offered at a given wage rate over a given period of what? Over a given period of time. And in that case, you need to understand the factors that affect the supply of labor. Hizo mtasoma. Sawa. The other one, when we have what we call the efficiency of labor. Now, when you talk about the efficiency of labor, in this case, is the ability to achieve a greater output within a relatively shorter period of time. Sawa, without compromising the quantity or the quality of the product. Sawa. That is the efficiency. The ability to achieve a greater output using the very shortest what? Time. You also need to understand the factors that affect what? The efficiency of labor. Then the other thing that you need to understand is also what we call the division of labor and what we call the what? Specialization. When you talk about division of labor and specialization, this is whereby you are subdividing the economic tasks of an organization and then ensuring that they are done by people who are specialized on that what? On that area. And in that case, that is what is bringing out what we call in specialization. So you also need to understand the advantages and also the disadvantages of division of labor and specialization. The other one is now the mobility of factors of production. The mobility of factors of production, in this case, there are normally two aspects of mobility. When we talk of the two aspects of mobility, we have what we call the occupational mobility, and we have what we call the what? The geographical mobility. Now, when you talk about the occupational mobility, in this case, it's just the ease movement of factors of production from one type of employment to another, from one given occupation to another occupation. That is what we mean when we talk about the occupational mobility. When we talk about the geographical mobility, this is the ease movement of the factors of production from one geographical area to another, or from one geographical location to another. So in this case, you need to understand the barriers to each of the mobility that I've talked about. Barriers to what we call the what? Occupational mobility, and also barriers to geographical mobility. And still on the same, you need to know the policies that can assist in those mobility or in mobilizing the factors of production in those areas. That is on the factor of the policies to assist in mobility of labor. That is generally the geographical policies and also the occupational what? The occupational policies. Then there is also what we call the production periods. Now, for the production periods in this case, we normally have two types of production periods. We have what we call the short run period, and we have what we call the long run what? Period. Whereby in this case, when we talk about the short run period, is just less than a year. Long run period is a period of more than what? More than 3 years. So in this case, first you need to understand when should a period be termed to be what? A short run period. When should a period be termed to be a short run period? And when is it supposed to be said to be a short run period? Yes? Yes. One of it is whereby some inputs remains what? Cannot remain what? Some inputs must remain fixed. They will not change. Reason is because your period, there is no time for you to change those inputs. Another one, we say that the farm cannot change, the farm in this case cannot change its scale of what? Reason is because it is limited of time. And in this case also, other organization or other farm cannot join the what? Industry in that case. Still on you need also to understand what we call the short run changes in production. The short run changes in production, whereby in this case now you be supposed to understand on what we call the marginal product, and not just marginal product. You need to understand on what we call the law of diminishing what? Diminishing returns, not marginal returns. The law of diminishing marginal returns. And then still again, you have to know on the long run changes in production. In that case, I know those ones, I even talked about that. We talked about the stages of production. The stages of production, we have the stage of increase in returns, which in this case, the stage of increase in return generally is also what we call the economies of what? Scale. We have the diminishing returns, and we also have the stage of decreasing returns. You also need to understand the importance of the law of diminishing returns, the law of diminishing returns, and then also you need to understand on the other area of now the long run changes, then that is on the long run period. Need to understand when period is supposed to be termed as long run period. And also you need to understand the long run changes in production. Now on the long run changes in production, in this case, this is now where we normally use what we call the isocost line and what we call the what? Isoquants. Which in this case, they are not different with the indifference curve. And also what we call the what? The budget line. The isoquants in this case in production, in the consumer, that is what we were talking about, the what? Indifference curves. Are we together? Then we have, because in this case in production, we are talking about the factors of production. So kama ni kutumia two types of, that is two factors of production, either capital and what? Labor. Sindio? That is now, we are relating these to production, but it's just the same concept. Same case to isocost what? Line, which is also the budget line. So for the isoquants, you need to understand the properties of isoquants, which are the same as the properties of indifference what? Curves. And then also you need to understand what we call that is on the isocost. On the isocost line, in this case, you also need to understand the what? You also need to understand the isocost, which in that case you have to relate it on what we call the budget what? Line. And then the last thing you need to understand is the firm's expansion fund and the law of diminishing return to scale. Firm's expansion fund and what we call the law of diminishing what? Return to scale. Hapo sasa ndo unafaa kuniambia there is what we call the homogeneous and what we call the non-homogeneous. There is where we say that the production is said to be homogeneous, and the other area we say that the production function will be non-homogeneous. When we talk about the homogeneous, in this case is whereby the production function is linear. Are we together? It is a straight line. But now for the non-homogeneous, in that case, the production function is not going to be a straight line. Itakuwa tu kama ina curve. Sawa. Sindio? Are we together? That is what we mean in that regard. The firm's expansion curve, and remember that is also a very common question when you check on some previous sittings there. The firm's expansion curve, when you check like I think should be, yes, should be the question in the sitting of what? There is a question that is talking about the firm's expansion curve. I think is the previous two sittings. Firm's expansion curve. On the firm's expansion curve, which in this case is I think I've ever talked about that question. No. It was which sitting? Yeah, it was on November 2016, question number 4B, using a profit diagram You explain the expansion curve as applied in the theory of what? The theory of production. So in that case, you need to understand how you can draw the firm's expansion curve. Now, let's get to a theory of what? Theory of cost. The theory of cost. Now, the theory of cost in this case, generally, you need to understand on what we call the short cost functions and what we call the long run what cost function. Short so in that case, what you need to understand on that case is just on the short run function and what we call the long run what? The long run cost function. Now, short run cost function in this case, you just need to understand on how to compute the what? Commonly, we know for you to get the total cost, the total cost is supposed to be what? Total fixed cost plus total variable cost. So, in this case, we can just do an example so that we may elaborate this further. Can try to do an example so that in this case I can elaborate this further. So we do this question in the sitting of the question in the sitting of June 2009. Question in the sitting of June 2009. June 2009. Question number what? Question number 3B. Question number 3. June 2009. Question number 3. A, you are required to talk about the properties of isoquants. I've talked about that. Then number B, you are required to the cost structure of the firm that manufactures gas cylinder is given below. You have the units of output, we have the fixed cost, we have the total variable cost. You are required, you compute the average cost, and then we have what we call the marginal cost of each what? Unit of what? Output. Of each unit of the output. So in this case, I will have to compute all of them. However, in this case, you are just required to get the average cost. But actually, to do how you get all these what? So in this case, I will have the number of what? Units. Or generally, this is the output. And then we have what we call the fixed cost, variable cost. We know we supposed to get the total cost. So now, how do you get the average variable cost? Average variable cost should be variable cost you divide by what? How will you get the average fixed cost? Fixed cost over what? Now, how do you get the average cost? Yes. Total cost over what? Now, how do you get the marginal cost? Marginal cost will be change in quantity. I mean total cost all over the change in what? Quantity. Sawa. Yes. So in this case, the units here we have them. We've been given 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 7. Still, what was the fixed cost here is how much? We've been given as 10 what? 10,000. 10,000. 10,000. 10,000. You have 10, 10, Sawa sawa. The 10,000 and then 10,000. So what is now the variable cost? Variable cost we've been given, this is 0. Remember, fixed cost is that cost that do not vary with the level of activity. Sawa sawa. But now for the variable, it has to vary with the level of activity. In this case, we have 12, 21. We also have 30. We also have 40,000. We also have 47,000. And we have what we call 52,000. So, now total cost, this one will be 10,000. The other one will be 15,000, 22,000. We have this will be 31,000. This is 40,000. This is 50,000. This is 57,62. Then the average variable cost is just the variable cost you divide by what? So in this case, hapo iko. Then number 2 is 15. 5,000 divided by that will be 5,000. 12,000 divided by 2, 6,000. 21, that will be 7,000. We have 30 divided by 4. Itakuwa ngapi? 30 you divide by 4. 30 divide by 4. 30 divide by 4. 7,500. This will be 8,000. This one will be, this is 47 divided by 6. Divide by 6, which is 70,833. And then 52 divided by 7, which in that case is 74,29. That is how you get the average variable cost. Now, in this case, you also do the same for the fixed cost. This will be 0. This will be 10,000. This will be 5,000. This will be 33,333. The other one will be 10,000 divided by 5 will be 30 divided by, that is 4, 2,500. Other one is 10,000 divided by 5, 2,000. And then 6, 10,000 divided by 6, which in that case is 1067. And then the other one is 10,000 divided by 7, which is 1429. So that is how you get that. Average total cost, you get the average cost is the total cost divided by the units. 0. 15 you divide by 1, that is 15. We have 22 divided by 2, that is 11. We also have that 1 divided by 3, divide by 3, which in that case is 10, 10, 3, 3, 3. Another one is 40 you divide by 4, which in that case it is 10,000. 50 you divide by 5, that is 10,000. Other one is 57 you divide by 6. 7 divided by 6, 95 what? 100. And then the other one is 62 you divide by 7, which in that case is 88.57. Now for the marginal cost, in this case, you just take the change in total cost over the change in quantity. The first one, we cannot get that. The second one, that is number 2. On number 2, on units number 1, it will be the total cost is 15,000 minus that, which is 5, will be 5,000. 22 minus 15 will be 7,000. That 1 minus 20, that 1 minus 22, 9,000. And that one is 30 minus, 40 minus that, which will be also 9,000, 10,000. And that one is 7,000. And then this will be 5,000. That is how you get the marginal cost. Change in total cost all over the change in what? The change in quantity or the inputs. Now, given the unit selling price of a gas cylinder is 12,000, you are required to do what? Determine the firm's profit maximization what? Level. So, determine the firm's profit maximization level. Which is the firm's profit maximization level? Which is the firm's profit maximization level? The firm's profit maximization level is whereby the marginal revenue, the marginal cost is what? Higher. And therefore the firm maximum utilization level, or the maximum in this case, will be which one? 5. See, is whereby the marginal cost is what? Higher. Sinisawa. That is whereby the firm will maximize profits. And therefore, in this case, the firm will maximize profits at what? How many units? So in our case, we've been asked the maximum what? Profits. So maximum profits, we will have to take the cost, the total revenue minus the total. So revenue we were given per unit ilikuwa inauzwa ngapi? 12,000. So you just take 12,000 multiply by 5, you minus the total cost. Total cost ilikuwa ngapi? 50,000. So itakuwa ngapi? That will be the maximum profits. The maximum profits. Maximum profits. So if you are asked about the relationship between either the average fixed cost, or maybe the average total cost, maybe the average cost and marginal cost, you can now take it from here. When you check on the total cost, hapa inaenda iki-increase. Sawa sawa. And as the total cost is increasing, look at the average. Average cost imeanza ikiwa 15,000, huko juu inaenda kama inafanya nini? Inateremka. The average cost is inafanya to the same way what the fixed cost is doing. Fixed cost ndo hii inateremka, average fixed cost. Same case with now the marginal cost. Hapo ukiangalia ilianza kidogo ikapanda, then ikafanya nini? Ikateremka. Sawa sawa. Yes, and that's why ukiichora inakanga hivi. You have to begin it this way. Ilianza juu ikateremka, then ikapanda. Sawa sawa. You will get to know the relationship between the two. So that is what you are required to understand on the theory of cost, on theory of cost. So the other thing is on market structures. Market structures and time that we have in is not going to allow us. We do on the market structures, so I'll do it in the next class. After which now we'll also be able to get to the national income accounting and also what we call the what. Generally, we'll now get to the macroeconomics. Macroeconomics, we have in the national income accounting, money and banking. We have also the inflation. We also have unemployment. They have also what? The economic growth and development and the international trade. We'll also talk about those in that other class. So we continue from there.